This is not an official podcast of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, NSDAR, and does not necessarily represent the position of the NSDAR. This interview is being conducted for the Daughter Dialogues Oral History Project. The interviewer is Risha Rainey. The narrator is Alelia Bundles. Alelia, most aspects of your life and the women of historical significance in your family are well documented. You are a public figure and award-winning journalist with a career spanning over 30 years as a network television news producer and executive. And you are the author of 4 biographies of your great-great-grandmother, Sarah Breedlove. Most of us know her as the great Madam C.J. Walker, who is recognized as the first self-made female millionaire, not just the first Black female millionaire, but the first self-made female millionaire in the United States of America. One of the goals of this oral history project is to elicit information which is not well known, or to bring information that is scattered into one source for each woman's narrative. But this poses quite a challenge for me since, in your words, this is what you do. You write and talk about your family and share your story. However, most people do not know that you descend from ancestors who contributed to this country's fight for independence and that you joined the Daughters of the American Revolution based on this lineage. So I would like to focus on that part of your story for this recording. However, it is important to also provide context by having you touch upon those well-documented women in your family. So if you will, let's please start with your sharing the story of your great-great-grandmother, Madam Walker.
Well, thank you, Risha. It's very nice to be with you and to be able to share this story. And you're right, very few people know the part of my story that involves actually 2 patriots who served during the Revolutionary War. But these stories do finally come together because of the patriot with Madam C.J. Walker. There is ultimately a connection that I can trace. But Madam C.J. Walker was born Sarah Breedlove in December 1867 on a plantation in Delta, Louisiana. That part of her story is well known. First child in her family born free. And by the time she died at 51 in 1919, she was a millionaire who employed thousands of African American women, had started a company, was a philanthropist and a political activist. But when she started out in Delta, Louisiana, she was orphaned at 7, married at 14, she said, to get a home of her own, a mother at 17. And her only child, Lelia, after whom I'm named, was from the marriage to Moses McWilliams. After he died when she was 20, Sarah and Lelia moved up the river to St. Louis, where her older brothers were barbers and had gone during the Exodusters migration during the late 1870s, early 1880s. Sarah Breedlove's only daughter, Lelia, was married 3 times, had no biological children, and adopted my grandmother, May, whose original name was Fairy Mae Bryant. And Fairy Mae Bryant has a connection to the Patriot. Fairy Mae Bryant is the 3rd great-granddaughter of Ishmael Roberts, who was in the Revolutionary War at Valley Forge. Sarah Breedlove and Lelia McWilliams, when they were living in St. Louis, met an uncle of May's. And when they moved to Indianapolis, May's biological grandmother was living across the street from them. And as folks do, I'm sure somebody must have said, "Who are your people?" I have some people in St. Louis, and they discovered that they had a common friend. And that person turned out to be May's uncle. May was the child May's father had died a few years before Madam Walker arrived in Indianapolis. And her mother, a descendant of one of the patriots, was the 3rd generation of women in her family to be a widow in her 30s with 8 children. May often visited her grandmother, who lived across the street from Madam Walker's factory, And Madam Walker and Alelia began to know May. She was a very smart kid. She was on the honor roll in school, but her family didn't have enough money to educate her. She began to travel around the country as a model with Madam Walker because she had very long hair, braids that she could sit on. And ultimately, they persuaded May's biological mother, who was still living, to allow them to legally adopt her with the promise that they would educate her and that she would be involved in the Walker Company. And they did just that. May went to Spelman, and May later became president of the company.
You just said words that I love to hear, that she went to Spelman College, because that is also my alma mater.
Well, that's great. Spelman is, yeah, I've done some great research there, and was excited when I finally found letters that about her enrollment and how she got there. And we can talk about that later.
Let's hear about that now. I'd love to hear more about May.
So when I was growing up, I didn't know May because May had died in 1945 when my mother, Alelia May Perry Bundles, was a freshman at Howard. So I never met May in person. But when my mother and I would visit her father in the apartment that had been May's apartment in Indianapolis in the mid-1950s, as my mother and my grandfather talked in the living room, I would go into what had been May's bedroom. And I began to discover, as I opened the dresser drawers, clothing and perfume and ostrich feather fans and opera glasses that had belonged to May and Madam Walker and Alelia Walker. So I was beginning to make some connection to these famous women. So when May was adopted by Alelia Walker, she moved to New York, where Alelia Walker had bought a townhouse in Harlem, and she was helping out with the company. But the Walker women were very friendly with Margaret Murray Washington, the wife of Booker T. Washington, whose niece, Laura, was a student at Spelman. And Madam and Alelia wanted May to get an education. And so Margaret Murray Washington wrote a letter to the principal at Spelman and said that May was a fine character, and she ended up being a student at Spelman Seminary between 1916 and 1920. I have one picture of her sitting on the lawn at Spelman and other letters. And then I did additional research in the wonderful Spelman archives and found the newsletters and the newsletter that was printed when she graduated, and she was one of the class orators and an honor student. So that made me very happy.
Was May the first to attend college in the Walker women line?
She was, yes, she was the first person. Both her biological family, who are the free people of color who were descended from the Patriot who migrated from North Carolina to Indiana in the 1820s and 1830s. As far as I know, she was the first person in that family to go to college. Certainly, Madam Walker did not go to college. She barely had more than second or third grade education. But Alelia Walker, Alelia McWilliams, Alelia Walker, had gone to Knoxville College for a year. On my mother's father's side of the family, they had been students in the 1880s. My mother's paternal grandmother had been at Oberlin with her siblings during the 1880s. And my mother's paternal great-grandfather had been valedictorian of his class at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania in the 1880s.
Were there any family stories about being proud of Fairy May being the first to attend or finish and complete? I assume she completed her degree there?
Yeah, right. Yes, at the seminary. That's an interesting question. I actually had very little contact with members of May's biological family when I was growing up. My mother died right after I finished college. I had met one of May's brothers, but I didn't really know her extended family until I really started doing more research about about Madam Walker. And interestingly, I knew May's family. I knew they were free people of color. I didn't know anything about the connection to a patriot. And I was going to the African American Historical and Genealogical Society conferences every year. There was a gentleman there named Coy Robbins who was from Indiana, which is where I grew up. And Coy said to me more than once, I know some things about your family. And I thought, okay, fine, but I'm really focused on Madam Walker and that family. And I know much more about my mother's father's family. So I had more than I could handle. And eventually, Coy started sending me information. And he knew about May's biological family, about their time in North Carolina, about their migration from North Carolina to Indiana in the 1820s and 1830s, because his stepsisters were my distant cousins. He is really the one who helped me to understand the amazing family that had migrated from North Carolina and created settlements of free people of color in Indiana in the 1820s and 1830s.
Do you have stories about those settlements that were created in Indiana? What did you hear about that? I know you said that you didn't have a lot of contact with May's family. Did you find any information in the family? Did you have access to any of her family records to find out more about that, or was that through external research?
Coy Robbins is really the person who laid the foundation for me to have even any of the understanding that I have, because he was a master genealogist. He had written a couple of books about the settlements of free people of color. So really everything that I learned in the beginning about May's extended family really comes from Coy's research. And then I did start to do research of my own. The Indiana Historical Society has a number of records about these settlements of free people of color. The Roberts settlement is really quite a famous settlement, and that was in Noblesville, just a few miles north of Indianapolis, and that's really where May was born and where much of her extended family lived. So that community is pretty well known. A lot of other people have done research. At the Indiana Historical Society, I also was able to find records about the families, because when free people of color moved to Indiana during the 1830s, they had to register with the state. The state really didn't want them, but they were being pushed out of North Carolina. So there are registers of colored people in among the holdings of the Indiana Historical Society. And there was a wonderful African-American archivist, Wilma Moore, who died a few years ago, but Wilma knew that collection extremely well. And as I was first starting to try to find information on my own about May, her family, the sort of the descendants of the Roberts and the Hammonds, but as I was starting to try to find information about her, Wilma brought one of the registers to me, and I saw the name Samira Thomas, who was one of my great-grandmothers, and it described her as a 5-foot mulatto. And I said, well, that would describe me if I had been arriving in Indiana at that point.
And how is Samira Thomas related to the Revolutionary War patriot?
Ishmael is the patriot. Ishmael's son Elias married Nancy Archer, whose father also was a patriot, but he is not as well known. And then they had Candace Roberts, and Candace is the mother of Samira.
Nancy Archer's father, Thomas Archer, was listed as head of household of 5 free colored in 1820 in North Carolina. He was identified as a Revolutionary War soldier. Ishmael Roberts, from whom you also descend, was listed as head of a Robeson County household of 10 other free in 1790. And from the information you provided me, he received pay for Revolutionary War service as a private in Colonel Abram Shepard's company. Colonel Shepard gave him a certificate which stated that he was furloughed at Headquarters Valley Forge to come home with him who was enlisted in his regiment for the term of 3 years and returned home with Colonel Shepard. So you descend from 2 Revolutionary War patriots, is that correct?
I do. But as I say, I know much more about Ishmael because he's the more famous of the 2. But the families who migrated from North Carolina, when you look at Paul Hynek's book, Paul Hynek is well known as the person who's written about free people of color in Virginia and North Carolina. When you look at his book and you look at Coy Robbins' books, some of the same last names are pretty common: Roberts, Hammond, and Archer. And I am descended both from Roberts and Archers.
Looking at the information about Ishmael Roberts, the register from the Lost Creek settlement in Indiana lists him as Lumbee Indian. How do you identify, or how did your research, what did you or your family say, how did he identify racially?
Well, as far as I know, he was a mixture of a whole lot of things. So I would say, African, Native American, and European. But as many people who have tried to do DNA testing have experienced, I don't have anything in the DNA testing that suggests that I have any indigenous blood. But I do know that the members of my grandmother's family always considered themselves to be Native American. You look at them, and I know that sometimes people say, yes, you look at people and so they have long braids. That doesn't really mean anything. So they have, a little hump in their nose. That doesn't mean anything. But if you look at my grandmother, she does look like many pictures of Native Americans. So I know that that's what the family believed, and they believed it to the extent that a number of them, including her grandmother and her great aunt and her aunt, all applied for Cherokee claims during the 19-teens and 1920s, I think, but they were denied, as were most African Americans, or people who at that point were being identified as African Americans. So the family lore seemed to support their belief that they were of Native American heritage, but there is nothing in my DNA, and they were denied the claims in the Cherokee claims.
Right. And when it comes to Ishmael Roberts, we don't know whether the DNA is correct that you've taken, the test that you've taken, or this historical record of the settlement, which states him as Lumbee Indian. It seems like they conflict with each other, and we don't really know.
We don't really know. And in all of the records, his wife is described as Sylvie, and Sylvie is always described as an Indian. So, as I say, certainly the members of the family who were in that generation believed that there was a connection to Native Americans. And the description of the settlement, there's a Roberts family website that describes him as Lumbee, and those descriptions are based on records that were, official county and legal records that described him as Lumbee.
And from the Roberts family website and other research that you've shared with me about this Lost Creek settlement, I learned that they were free people of color that came there from North Carolina and Virginia to settle in Indiana because there was just a lot of tension going on from where there was the slave revolts and uprisings were affecting the free people of color and their safety. So they kind of got out of there and moved from North Carolina to Indiana, from my understanding. And they also followed Quakers because they were living alongside them in North Carolina and Virginia. And since they were accepting, they wanted to follow and be where they were going in Indiana and live alongside them as well. Is that also what your research has shown you?
Yeah,
have you heard anything differently?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That when you look at some of the great research that John Hope Franklin did years and years ago on free people of color in North Carolina, and the subsequent research that others have done, it really is clear that the legislature in North Carolina began to tighten the laws because they were threatened by the presence of free people of color, and they made it very uncomfortable, especially after some of the well-known uprisings of enslaved people that happened during the 1820s. So it became very unsafe for free people of color to be there. And members of my family, based on these records that we both have seen, owned property, hundreds of acres of property, but had to dispose of that property or abandon that property because they did not feel that their lives were safe.
How does that make you feel being a descendant of pioneers?
It is a very interesting place to be. I've always felt that my members of my family had made important contributions, been good citizens, fought in wars, even before I knew about the Revolutionary War patriot. But it just solidifies for me the presence and the importance of people of African descent in America. So I think that almost nothing makes me angrier than to hear someone talk about real Americans as if people of color, as if people of African descent don't have a stake and haven't made a contribution. So knowing that members of my family have been here since before the revolution, and that members of my family were among people who helped to settle Indiana, a state that most people consider predominantly white and don't think of Black people as being there, even though we are there. It makes me feel, very proud, actually, to be able to say that I have a stake in America, and I, really reject the idea that real Americans are not also people of African descent.
And when the people of color settled in Indiana, they had their own churches and schools in that settlement. And from the research that you also shared with me, they were on par with the other schools that were being built there because, again, they did share those settlements with white people as well.
It really is something when you think that, and they clearly were identifying as people of African descent. They founded African Methodist Episcopal churches in each of the communities where they initially settled and then where they subsequently migrated to other parts of the state. So they knew who they were, and they were very industrious people. They were used to farming. They were creating communities. And they were taking advantage of opportunities for themselves and for their children.
I want to go back to Ferry's mother, A'Lelia Walker. How does it feel to have so many women in your family share the same name? Does that cause confusion? How do you feel about that, having your name be the namesake and recycled 3 times because your mother's also named A'Lelia? Is that correct?
Right. I don't know. We're all so separate that I don't feel any confusion. I'm sure it's confusing to other people, but it doesn't. When I say A'Lelia, I know that I'm not talking about myself. Other people may not know that. But A'Lelia Walker was originally Lelia. Her name was Lelia McWilliams. That was her birth name.
And that was your great-grandmother.
That's my great-grandmother through adoption versus my great-grandmother who is my biological great-grandmother not through adoption. But A'Lelia Walker was born Lelia McWilliams, and A'Lelia Walker was married 3 times. Her husbands were Robinson, Wilson, and Kennedy. But her mother's 3rd husband was Charles Joseph Walker, and her mother became famous as Madam C.J. Walker. So she added the Walker to her name so that people would know she was related to her wealthy mother. So A'Lelia Walker was born Lelia McWilliams, but later in life, she added the A apostrophe. And from my research, because I'm doing a major biography of her now, she added it in 1922 after she had returned to Harlem from a 4-month trip that took her to London, Paris, Rome, Monte Carlo, Cairo, Addis Ababa, Palestine, throughout Europe and the Middle East and Northern Africa. And I don't know exactly why she added the A apostrophe. You would think after I've done years of research, I would know this, but there were a few other people, surprisingly, whose names also were Lelia Walker, people married to people named Walker, some of whom were other prominent African Americans. And she, I think, just didn't want to have the same name, so added this A apostrophe. Well, that name, Alelia, then became my mother's name. So Alelia Walker adopted Fairy Mae Bryant, who became Mae Walker, who went to Spelman. And then when Mae married her second husband, my grandfather, Marion Perry, their daughter was named Alelia Mae after her grandmother and her mother, Alelia Mae Perry. And then when my mother and father had me, I was named Alelia Perry Bundles. And there are a few other Alelias. Madam Walker's attorney, F.B. Ransom, had his only daughter was Alelia Walker's goddaughter. She was born in 1919. Her name also was Alelia. But we all knew each other.
Wow.
We didn't get confused.
Right. Do you feel any differently about your lineage or heritage or ancestry through your biological line versus your adopted line?
Not really. I mean, I think when you grow up knowing all of that, each one has its own particular place. And, and I have seen some people who are, say, well, you're not really related to Madam Walker because of adoption. And I think, okay, well, that's fine. But you can say that, but I can't think of any family that adopts somebody who would not consider that adopted child as a real part of their family. I also think that with this connection to Madam Walker and Alelia Walker comes some responsibility. And I think each generation in my family has had, both the good parts and the bad parts that go along with it. So I don't feel like I have to say I don't have any connection. I do have a real connection, and it's a legal adoption. And I feel as if I have helped to tell the story to make sure that their story is preserved. I doubt that there would have been a Netflix series if I had not been such a diligent researcher. But I also very much appreciate Mae's biological family and the decision that was made for her to be legally adopted, because a mother who had 8 children in her 30s, who's a third-generation widow, knew exactly what was in store for her children.
And I assume that you also feel the gravity of that decision to know that she was around 12 years old when this adoption was made. So it meant that she had plenty of time to bond with her biological mother, and then to leave that family unit and to go with her new mother, Alelia. Did you hear anything about that?
Yeah, no, of course. And of course it is not, it wasn't a severing of the relationship. She remained close to her siblings. And I remember as a little girl meeting one of her brothers. I would go with my mother to her office at the Walker Building in Indianapolis. And I remember meeting one of the brothers. She had brothers who were twins. And they were, it was always the kind of an interesting description. One of the brothers was described as light-skinned with kinky hair, and the other was dark-skinned with straight hair. That was the sort of the mix of all of the the ancestors. But the one particular brother to whom she remained particularly close was someone that my mother introduced me to. she had an aunt, one of her mother's sisters, her biological mother's sisters, Aunt Dell, who was very much a part of my mother and her brother's lives when they were growing up, and especially because their mother died when they were in their teens. So there was definitely a connection between May's biological family, her siblings, and extended family throughout the rest of her life.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about you in your personal life. Do you mind sharing how old you are?
Sure, I'm 68 years old. I was born in 1952.
And you were born where?
I was born in Chicago, and I grew up in Indianapolis.
What were some of your strongest memories from childhood?
Well, let me see. I have a faint memory of Chicago. I was there until I was about 18 months old, and we lived at 51st and Drexel near the University of Chicago, and there were a few other sort of striving young Black couples who went on to do interesting things. John Johnson of Ebony lived not too far away. I remember my parents' friends who we would sometimes go visit in the summers. We would go to Chicago. We then moved to Atlantic City, where we lived for about a year and a half. And I have some memories of being on the beach in Atlantic City. And then we moved to Indianapolis when I was 3 years old. My brother Lance was born shortly after we moved there. And I remember having a little brother and being excited about that. But then we built a house in what was a new Black suburban neighborhood just north of Indianapolis. And it was really kind of an idyllic childhood. My father and the men who were his friends, many of them had gone to Indiana University when housing was still largely segregated. He was a member of the Kappas. And I just remember this group of men who were dentists and businessmen and carpenters and doctors who, all were just strong family men. And most of the mothers worked. Many were school teachers, but my mother was unusual because she was a business executive. But we lived in this suburb of all newly built homes. And you could leave your bicycle out. We played hide and go seek, and the mothers had a neighborhood association. It was really quite a very special childhood. At the same time, we all knew we were Black. There was no question about it. We went to predominantly white schools, in fact, overwhelmingly white schools. But just as with other families, we were solidly middle class. But as with all Black families, there's a whole range of, economic difference going on. And you had friends, you have relatives, other people who in your church and other parts of the community who represent a real range of advantage and sometimes disadvantage. So I feel as if I grew up with a realistic sense of the world. My father had come from a family that really was quite poor. He was the seventh of 9 children. And when I was a little girl, I remember the house that his parents lived in didn't have indoor plumbing. So I am old enough to have seen the difference. But that was, very much a part of the experience of having a wide range of family members who had different experiences, but everybody was a hard worker. To say my father's father was a real go-getter. He even though he had very little education, he worked on the railroad. He was a laborer on the railroad. He always had a side hustle, and I admired that about him.
What about your father? What did he do for his occupation?
My father was a businessman, but interestingly, when I was in junior, I'm going to tell you this story. It's a little bit of roundabout, but my father was a business executive. He was president of a Black hair care company called Summit Laboratories. So theoretically, my parents were competitors. Shortly after my parents married, my father went to work as the general manager at the Walker Company. Uh, but he was hired away because he was so good at what he did by a competitor. But at that point, the Walker Company during the late 1950s was no longer a major competitor.
Was your mother working there?
Right. My mother was vice president
Okay.
of the company. But my father really had started out with aspirations to be a journalist. And I began to discover that in junior high school when I started working for the school newspaper. And I had no idea that my father had been interested in journalism. But when he was a student at Indiana University, he started working for the school newspaper. And he, we think, is the first, if not, one of the first, if not the first, African Americans to graduate in journalism from Indiana University. He went to the war in the middle of his college time and worked for Stars and Stripes in Hawaii. And then he came back, got his degree. And when he graduated from Indiana University, he applied for jobs at the white newspapers in Indianapolis, and they would not hire him on the editorial side. But he was hired as the manager for the delivery boys. But even then, he used that time to mentor other young people. And ultimately, after my mother died, he had to make some different career choices because I still had a young brother at home. And he became the first president of what was called the Center for Leadership Development, which now has mentored thousands of young African Americans in Indianapolis and provided millions of dollars of scholarships. But he had that knack for leadership that was seen even then, even when he was denied an opportunity to work on the editorial side. Sort of an interesting story with that I discovered when I went to my 45th reunion at Harvard a couple of years ago. I told this story because my dad died and last year, and I wrote about this I wrote an article about it and I posted it on our class Facebook page. And one of my classmates said that her father and her grandfather were from Indianapolis, had both worked at the Indianapolis Star, and just that her father, my father were the same age, and what a difference their experiences had been because of the color of their skin.
Right. And you mentioned that the Walker Company had the business was winding down during your childhood. Is that correct?
That's right. So the Walker Company had been one of the premier Black hair care companies. Apex, that had been founded by Sarah Spencer Washington, Poro, that had been founded by Annie Malone, and the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company were the big three women-founded companies. There were other Black-owned companies that were well known during the teens, 20s, and 30s. And there were companies even before them making essentially the same kind of products. But those were the three big names. And the Walker Company and Poro and Apex all had beauty schools. And so they trained thousands of African American women. But after the death of Sarah Spencer Washington in the late 40s, and then after Annie Malone at Poro began to have both legal and financial problems and a nasty divorce in the 20s, and then after Madam Walker's death, the companies began to lose some of their market share. And there was, of course, always competition with white-owned companies who would undercut their prices. So, but these companies still had the reputation. They still had the prestige within the Black community. But by the 1950s, those company models were being disrupted. So just as we have seen how the internet disrupted newspapers, these three companies were basically focused on what was the press and curl way of doing hair with the hot comb, which Madam Walker did not invent, despite what people say. But those three companies, women founded, the founders either had died or the companies were having trouble. And in the 1950s, their business model was disrupted because now there were companies like Johnson Products and Summit Labs, for which my dad was president, and Soft Sheen, that were introducing chemical hair straighteners for African American women. So those were the companies that were really on the ascendancy in the late 1950s.
How did that affect the financial stability of your home when you were growing up?
Well, my dad's company was much more successful, so it made it better, actually.
How did your mom feel about that? Like you said, it was kind of, they were in competition.
Yeah, but not really. I mean, by that point, my mother she was vice president of the company. That was what she had been expected to do. She'd gone to Howard and majored in chemistry and business, and that was what she was doing. But my dad, as I say, my dad was hired as a sales manager for the company, and he did that for a few years. But he was really good at what he did. And I'm not just saying that because it was my dad. He was really a good salesman, and he was hired away by a competitor to be the president of a company that ultimately became quite successful and was one of the companies on the Black Enterprise 100. They did very, very well, but that was through his management, but also because that was one of the companies that was making what was very popular at the time, the chemical hair straighteners. So it was really my mother's family had the interesting history and the prestige and the heritage of having been a founder of the hair care business. But my dad's business was a much more successful business when I was growing up.
Why did your mother feel that she needed to go to college? You said she went to Howard University and majored in chemistry and business. Why did she want to spend the time in school if she was descending from a successful business? I know you said it was winding down, but at that time, was it still successful enough where she thought that maybe she could inherit, this business and not have to go to school?
No, I don't think that would ever have crossed her mind, that you wouldn't go to college. Her mother had gone to college at Spelman. Her father had gone to Lincoln. He was the second generation of men in his family to graduate from Lincoln. Her maternal grandparents had gone to Oberlin and Lincoln University. So I don't think it ever would have occurred to her that she wasn't going to college. She went to boarding school at Palmer Memorial Institute. Everybody at Palmer went to college. She actually, I think, was interested in going to Wellesley, but Wellesley only accepted one Black student a year at that point. And she was really interested in Howard. So I think it just would never have occurred to her that she wasn't going to college and that she wasn't supposed to get a college education. I mean, I think, I think part of, what I hear, if I'm interpreting this correctly, what I hear you saying in that is, if somebody has some wealth or some means, and that means that they don't really have to, work for it, or they inherit it. But that has never been even remotely a conversation in my family, that you have to have your own identity, your own accomplishments. The fact that I now spend a lot of time writing about Madam Walker in my post-corporate life, that I tell her story, and is something that would never have happened if I had not created my own identity. I really had no particular interest in telling this story because I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to do what I felt a passion about. And from the time I was 8 years old, when I first discovered that I could write, that's what I wanted to do. And both of my parents encouraged that. They never said, you need to work in the family business. That wasn't even a conversation. It was, you are supposed to do the thing that you love. Coincidentally, those things intersected when I was a student at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism and trying to figure out the topic for my master's paper. Thankfully, I had Phyllis Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty, as my advisor. And Phil's mother had been an editor at the Pittsburgh Courier. Phil had been a reporter for Jen and Ebony. And I think she knew that my name, A'Lelia, had a connection to Madam Walker, but she didn't know. I wasn't talking about that. I wasn't going around talking about that. And when we talked about topics, and I gave her some very, I'm sure, cliched topics, at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?" And I said, "Yes, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." And that was 1975. And there were very few books being published by or about African Americans. Roots was about to be a big hit. But it was really Phil planting that seed for me and validating it as a story worth pursuing. That otherwise I might not have done it.
You wanted to have your own identity, and you have this love of writing. You discovered it when you were 8 years old. Take me back to when you were 8 and you discovered it. How did you discover you liked writing? What were the things that you liked to write about? What did you do with it in your early childhood through your youth?
I like to write stories, and I wrote a story about going to the moon. So this was if I was 8 years old, this was about 1960 or so. So long before an American person set foot on the moon. I don't even know where I got the idea, but I wrote this story. I imagined myself being on the moon, and one of my mother's best friends, who was a school teacher and who was spending her summer doing IQ tests for all the children in the neighborhood, read my story. And she thought it was a great story, and she sent it to the Jack and Jill magazine. And the story was published. And this is long before you could just go create a blog. So this was a big deal. I had a byline at 8 years old. But I knew that writing what made me feel special. And I knew that I could create a scene and I could create an emotion. So I guess in the same way that people who are really talented as singers, which of course I am not, and I cannot carry a tune, but I think maybe in that same way that if you know you have a great voice, I just knew that that's what I love doing. And I continued to write stories in school. Some people say, they'll say, "Oh, I wrote a book when I was 9 years old." I didn't do that. But when I got to seventh grade in junior high school, my science teacher of all people had us fill out a 5x8 card and ask for our parents' contact information. I don't know, I guess if we dropped dead in the class, they needed it. But I filled out the 5x8 card, and he also asked us to write our hobbies. And I put writing. So I must have at that point been identifying myself as a writer. And the next day he said, "You should try out for the school newspaper." And I was really lucky that the newspaper was run very professionally by the newspaper advisor, and we won national awards that high school kids won. So I had a really great, from seventh grade on, I had really great training as a journalist.
Do you remember any stories that maybe stand out to you that you wrote about in high school?
In junior high school, I did an interview with Diana Ross.
Wow, how did you land that?
Right, how did I land that? One of our neighbors was a musician named Larry Liggett, whose band often played for the visiting musicians at Clues Hall, the fancy concert hall in Indianapolis. And his son and I were both on the school newspaper, and he was able to arrange a time for us to talk for like 2 minutes backstage with Diana Ross. So we did a really quick interview with her. So that was my biggest memory from junior high school.
And you said, was that also a mostly white school that you went to for junior high school?
When we moved into this black suburb, all these new houses, within that neighborhood was a new elementary school. But the rest of the area around us was still predominantly white. So when I started first grade at Grandview Elementary School, there were maybe about 12 black kids in the whole school. By the time I finished, the white people had started moving out. The neighborhood was becoming, less white, but it was still predominantly white. When I got to junior high school, that was 3 different districts coming together. We were still very much in the minority. And when I got to high school at North Central High School, 3 grades with about 3,400 students, black students were somewhere between 4 and 5% of the student population. So I always went to predominantly white schools.
How is that if you were living in a black neighborhood, were the schools nearby? How does that work with, zoning districts? How did you get over to these white schools? Were they not part of your neighborhood schools?
Yeah, it was we were not bused into another area. We were the the immediate neighborhood, which was maybe, 10 square blocks of this new development. But all over, there was a Jewish neighborhood that was not too far away, and all the boys played together played little league together in the neighborhood. So, and it was an affluent neighborhood. So we were moved in together. We all went to the same school, and I would say I there was very little. It wasn't like my friends who had gone to all black schools and all black neighborhoods who then were bused into white neighborhoods. I didn't have that same experience that sounds extremely uncomfortable, where you knew you weren't wanted. We were very much a part of what was going on. My mother was president of PTA. I was a good student. My teachers were very nice to me, with one exception, but I think she was just a weird woman. But I feel like I had a really good education and a welcoming education. By the time I got to high school, I was experiencing some racism, but I also had people, faculty members who were my champions. So I worked at the school on the school newspaper. I was the first black vice president of student council, but it was the late 1960s, so I was starting to get politically radical, and I was starting to read things like W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk and paying attention to what was going on politically. And there was some backlash to some of my successes. I was elected vice president of student council, coincidentally on the same day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And I knew that the next day there were parents, some white parents, who called the school objecting to that. The next year, when I ran for president of student council, I got some catcalls from the audience. And the principal's son, who had never been involved in any real leadership activities, was on the slate against me. So that was, was it a rigged election?
Right. But if you were elected, that means that the majority of the students supported you. Was it just a small fraction of the students and parents that were against your being vice president?
I mean, I don't know what the final votes were, but you think between 68, after Martin Luther King's assassination, you can just imagine in a predominantly white area that there are people who are serious racists. Indiana was, less right wing then than it is now, but it was definitely there were definitely people who were not my friend. I had a government teacher who was on the Americanism committee of the American Legion, who, when I wore an armband on Moratorium Day, wanted to try to have me expelled. I had another white friend who was really quite outspoken, and he was suspended from school. So there was a lot going on. 68 to 69 was a really volatile period of time. And at the same time, I had lots of people who were in my corner, and I was a good student. So there was really not a whole lot you could do to me.
So you decided to go on to Harvard College, and did you just aspire to go to one of the top or the top university in the country? Did you feel some pressure that, hey, I descend from this great legacy of the first female self-made millionaire in the United States? And did you feel like you had to be just as great and do amazing things? Was there some type of pressure? What inspired you to go to an elite school such as Harvard?
Yeah, great question. And I would say I felt zero pressure. That this is the wisdom of my wonderful mother, who herself had had so many expectations on her. I think she wore them well. But when she would walk across campus at Howard, years later, I had a cab driver who said he had gone to Howard. And I said, "Oh, my mother went to Howard." He said, "What was her name?" And I said, "Amelia Perry." He said, "Oh, we would see her walk across campus and go, money, money, money." And she knew that. And she was still a very down-to-earth person, but she did not want me to have that pressure. which is why I was encouraged to do the things that I was really interested in. So I was pretty much my own person. I knew that I was interested in journalism. I knew that I wanted to leave Indiana because it was very conservative politically. I wanted to get away from there. I had already gone away a couple of summers to a journalism camp at Northwestern and a journalism camp at University of Kansas. So I knew I had visions of other places. We had traveled on family vacations to New York and other places, and I really wanted to be in New York. But I think my mother wanted me to go to Sarah Lawrence, which I didn't have any real interest in, and my father wanted me to go to Radcliffe. But when we went on the campus trips, my dad and I went to New York and Boston. And I know he did not want me in New York. But the first night we got to New York, we went to the Copacabana to see Gladys Knight and the Pips. That was big and fancy, vacation kind of fun. And then the next morning, we went to Horn and Hardarts, which isn't around anymore, but it was what was called an automat, where you put a nickel in the machine or a quarter in the machine and get your food out. It's really down and dirty. And then we went to my interview at Barnard, and I'm thinking, Barnard, that's where I want to be. I want to be in New York, in the big city. And then the next morning, we flew to Boston, and I had an interview at Boston University as a safety school. And then we went to Radcliffe, and it was a beautiful day. It was October. There were boats on the water, and we walked around Harvard Square. It wasn't cold. I had no idea. But so we got back home. I did my list. My father and mother had me do the pros and cons of each place. And what did I want to do? I still wanted to be in New York. The acceptances came, and my father's lesson of, when we went to New York, we went to the Copacabana, and we had vacation money when we go to New York. But when you're in school, you don't have vacation money. Just think about that Horn and Hardarts. So my dad's wisdom prevailed, and I ended up going to Radcliffe and Harvard, and then to Columbia for graduate school. So I got it all that I wanted, but my dad's advice was really very smart.
Well, when you applied, did the admissions officers have any idea about your family legacy?
I don't know. I really don't know whether they did or not.
What was your experience like when you were at Radcliffe, and how did that relate to Harvard?
So the classes in the dorms were all co-ed by that time. And they really had been, not the dorms, but the classes had been co-ed since World War II.
Because Radcliffe was a women's school, correct?
Right. Radcliffe started as a women's school in 1879. But by the 1940s, women were in the classes at Harvard. It was no longer really totally separate as an annex. And by the 1970s, when I got there, everything was co-ed. The difference between Radcliffe and some of the other women's schools is that Radcliffe still had a pretty hefty endowment that it wanted to control. So women were admitted to Radcliffe, but graduated with a degree from Harvard. 300 women would be admitted to Radcliffe every year. 1,200 men would be admitted to Harvard. But all of our classes were together. And then ultimately there was a merger, non-merger, and then the dissolution of Radcliffe, where it became Radcliffe Institute. But so, yeah, my experience is that I was a student at Harvard. I was admitted to Radcliffe, but the dorms were co-ed. I had a great time in Cambridge, but my freshman year I was pretty miserable because my friends who were at Spelman and Howard were having a much better time than I was socially. So I was ready to transfer, but my father would hear nothing of that. And then sophomore year, I started working at the radio station at WHRB. And so I finally found my home. And that made all the difference for me. I found a place where I was comfortable.
While you were at Harvard, it was mostly men, as you've described to me, since you were part of Radcliffe at that point. How was it being a female at Harvard in the 70s, as well as a Black female?
Well, I didn't have the sense that it was mostly men in sort of an overwhelming way that I think maybe people at Princeton or Yale might have felt, because there had been women as a part of the community for a really long time. So there wasn't that sense of you're in an entirely male environment. And I actually lived in the Radcliffe dorms all 4 years. I stayed up at the Radcliffe Quad, which was still predominantly women. But I really didn't have a sense of, all the classes being mostly men. Maybe it was the classes I took, but I didn't feel overwhelmed by the male environment. And as I think about this, there really was a very strong community of women because of the history of Radcliffe, and Radcliffe being a much more integrated into Harvard life than, say, maybe Jackson or Barnard or some of the other schools that were women's schools affiliated with male schools. And I noticed this at reunions. I have never missed a reunion for my class. And at my fifth reunion, the show of women was so strong. And I later would compare notes with friends who had been among the first classes of women at Princeton, for instance, or at Yale, and they didn't have that tradition of women. And I think that made a real difference in my experience, both as an undergraduate and as an alumna.
How about your race? Did it impact you? Did you feel different because you were Black?
Well, it's complicated in a sense, because on the one hand, this was the first time that there were more than a couple of Black people in my classes, because I had always gone to predominantly white schools, and because I tended to be one of only a couple of Black people in the what would be considered AP classes. So it was great to be around a whole lot of other really smart Black people so that I wasn't the weird one. So so that was a relief. And I think during that period of time, especially, I was all of a sudden in a community of other really great, excellent Black students, and our community in the early 70s, which was when Boston had I think for the first time, a critical mass of Black students in the metropolitan area, and people partied together. We socialized together. So I primarily had a Black community experience when I was an undergraduate. So I didn't feel isolated in the way that I think some students actually may feel now. I was not a churchgoer, but my college roommate became very involved at the AME Church in Cambridge, where a lot of other Black students from the metropolitan area were involved, and they were going to lunch and dinner with the families who were part of the community. My college roommate was one of the people who created the Kumba Singers, which now is very much a part of the music community at Harvard. So I would say that some of the things that became apparent to me after I had graduated, but all I knew is that I really liked staying at Radcliffe because there weren't roaches in the dorm, like there were in the river houses. So some of those things that people whose parents had gone to Harvard, or people who had gone to boarding schools and then gone to Harvard, and they had that community of a Harvard legacy, that their experience was probably different. Certainly, my community was mostly Black when I was an undergraduate, but because I continued to go to reunions after I graduated, and I was secretary of my class, I have made a much wider circle of friends. Many more white friends who I didn't really know when I was an undergraduate, but we share this common bond of having been in Cambridge at the same time, and they've become good friends of mine.
After Harvard, you went on to study at Columbia University. So you made it to New York. You were dead set on getting to New York, and you made it.
Yeah, exactly. As I said, my dad really engineered that. I have to say that he was smarter than I was at the time, and I appreciate that. But after I graduated, I went back to Indianapolis for 3 months, and I worked in news at a black radio station, WTLC. And then I had applied to Columbia, but I was waitlisted. And as soon as I accepted a job at DuPont in Wilmington, Delaware, a couple of days later, I was taken off the wait list. But I decided that I would spend a year working in Wilmington so that I could make some extra money. And then I did that in the public affairs department at DuPont for a year, exactly a year, from Labor Day to Labor Day. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. But it had allowed me to save some money so that when I moved into the dorm in New York, I had enough money to occasionally go out to dinner and sometimes even go to the theater.
So Dad, who said, oh, when you're in New York, we don't have money to vacation. You're there to go to school. Now that you were in graduate school and had a job for a year, you could still kind of enjoy the social life while you were in New York.
Exactly.
And while you were there, you mentioned that your advisor encouraged you to write about Madam C.J. Walker. Were there any other stories that are very memorable or experiences from your time at Columbia?
Well, the good thing about being at Columbia is that you are in a network of people who are both friends and professors who really are at the top of their game and people who go on to be leaders in the industry. So it was a great place to go to school. I don't think you really learn journalism. I think I already knew journalism when I got there because I'd been doing it since seventh grade. But I did develop a finer sense of the business and of the colleagues, and people who would remain colleagues and who would be friends. But my year at Columbia was marked by a really significant event. My mother had been diagnosed with lung cancer the summer before I arrived, and she was really very ill. She was terminal. And when I went back to Indianapolis for Christmas, she was in the hospital. And, I at 23 years old, really didn't have the concept of my mother dying. Obviously, she was very sick, but my mother died during the Christmas holidays. So the rest of the semester was a bit of a blur. I was writing my master's paper, but I know that as I look back on it, I was in deep grief.
How did you manage to continue on and press on to continue your studies and your project that you were writing?
Yeah, well, I just, that there was just nothing to do except to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I know that was what my mother would have wanted me to do. And her mother had died when she was a freshman in college. So I guess the example that she set was that you just keep carrying on. But I did have I think the last conversation I had with her, I was telling her about the paper that I was writing about Madam Walker, and she shared some things with me. My grandfather shared things with me. I knew other people I had interviewed for this paper, but I remember saying to her that I was finding things that didn't fit the myth of Madam Walker, essentially, that we knew that she was born in Delta, Louisiana, and the first child in her family born free and a washerwoman until she was 38 and started a hair care company and then died a millionaire. So that was the story that people knew. But I also was starting to discover things about her personal life that I never knew. I don't even know if my mother knew. And I said, so I'm finding things that, she's not perfect. And as you would do if you're doing biography and not hagiography. And I said, well, what do I do about that? And my mother in her hospital bed said, tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth. And that was a great gift for me, to not feel that I had to gloss over something and whitewash a story, but to really be able to tell the story as I discovered it. And I'm really glad about that, because I think that there are many people who write about their families and feel that they have to keep secrets or they have to not tell the full truth. And I was given permission by my mother to tell the story that I found.
What are some of the truths that resonate most with you?
Well, Battle Walker was married 3 times, and she never divorced the second husband, and so that sort of came back to bite her. That was, the second husband came back after she died, and wanted a settlement from the estate. So that certainly wasn't part of the story that she was telling. I think that at that point she had started off as such a poor woman when she left that husband that she never had any idea, of course, that she was going to become the famous Madam C.J. Walker. So that was one of the things. But there were other stories, not so much that she was trying to cover up, but just that were interesting to me, in particular, as she became wealthier and more successful. She also, to my delight, became more politically radical. And I learned that she and Ida B. Wells had been followed by a black spy during World War One, and because they were essentially speaking out against lynching and on behalf of black soldiers, that they were labeled Negro subversives. And there was a military intelligence report about them saying that they were dangerous. So I loved that, but I loved especially finding out that she didn't fit this sort of narrow description that had been in, to the degree that she was written about in books, Black history books, that she was much more interesting and much more multidimensional than the little short story that people often told.
After you graduated from Columbia, tell me about your career.
When I went to Columbia, I had taken that year off, and Columbia at that point, this is mid-70s, when the networks and major news organizations realized that they needed to have more diversity in their newsrooms. So I was a beneficiary of both women suing NBC News and Newsweek and opening the doors for women, and the desire for more Black people, maybe not the desire, but the pressure for more Black people. But Columbia had started something called the Michelle Clark program. Michelle Clark had been, I think, the first Black woman to be a correspondent at CBS, and she'd been killed in a plane crash. And so the Columbia, with money from the networks, started this summer program that resulted in a whole lot of the people that we know from that generation who ended up being in journalism. In addition to that, NBC had created a scholarship, a fellowship, and I was the recipient of the NBC RCA fellowship that year. So I went to, I had come in the door with that connection to NBC. As a result, when I graduated in the summer of 1976, I joined NBC in a management training program, the Associates program, which was geared towards increasing the number of people of color in the management track. So I went to work at NBC, and I interned essentially in several different areas, in radio and local television, with nightly news, and with radio. So I got that experience of moving around. NBC, all people who are in the journalism track have to join the union, the NABIT union, which is the engineers union, which is kind of a weird thing, but I had to join the union. And at the end of my first year, NBC was laying off something like 70 people who were considered writers and who were in that union. And I was at the very bottom of that list. So in order for me to continue to be an employee of NBC, I either needed to leave. I needed to leave. If I wanted to remain an employee, I had to go to a non-union bureau. NBC had 2 non-union bureaus, one in Houston, one in Atlanta. And somebody else got first pick. I got second pick. And so the job in Houston was the job that was available to me. And I went kicking and screaming because I had no desire to leave New York. But I also had a desire to have a job and not be unemployed. So
Right.
I agreed to go to Houston. As it turns out, it was the best thing that could have happened because I arrived in it's a small bureau with a correspondent, a bureau chief, one other producer, two camera crews who all had a lot of experience, and it was the place where I could learn something. If I'd stayed in New York, I would have been pigeonholed and not had the opportunity to do things. But because I was the only other producer, I was the next person up, and I got to get a lot of experience working with really veteran folks who were great mentors for me.
Was there more diversity in the Houston office?
No, not at all. I mean, I am definitely one of those people who can say that some of my best mentors were white men. The camera crews were old, sort of grizzly old guys, and who had covered civil rights, and um, one was from Alabama originally, one was from Texas originally, and they basically said to me, "Bundles, if you don't act like you know everything, we'll teach you." And I even had an experience I had covered a Klan rally. My bureau chief was Jewish, and when they needed a person to go to Tupelo, Mississippi, there was nobody available in the Atlanta bureau. They called Houston. They said, "We need somebody." And he said, "You're going." And he said, "You're a journalist." Some of my other colleagues thought he was crazy, but he knew what he was doing. I mean, the crew that he sent me with were basically two old boys from Alabama, and they watched out for me. So it was an interesting experience. But I think I learned how to be a journalist from these folks. They wanted to make sure that I was stepping up, and they were there to support me while I did.
Were you nervous when you were sent to Mississippi?
It was just a weird kind of surreal thing. I still had a really huge afro. I flew into Memphis. The only rental car that was available was a red Camaro. So I drove from Memphis to Tupelo to meet the camera crew and the correspondent who had come in from Atlanta, who happened to be Latino. And we had the camera crew, but it was really one of those kind of fakey Ku Klux Klan rallies where the police were the police were enabling it. There was a few people who were driving down the street, and they lit a cross later that night. We covered that, but it wasn't really that threatening. It was just probably some drunk old guys, and I never felt threatened. I think the the reporter has written a book recently where he describes me um, as I think much bolder than I actually was. But there was at that point there weren't any cell phones because we're talking the early 1980s, and the only way that I could call the New York desk was to go into what was a little kind of pool hall cafe, which obviously was where these guys hung out. But I walked right on in there and I used the telephone. But what were they going to do? You know?
Where else did your career take you after that?
So in Atlanta, when I was still in Atlanta, I covered a wide range of stories from hurricanes to grain elevator explosions. I also covered the Atlanta child murders, which was a big story. And then when Jesse Jackson ran for president in 1984, I was one of the producers for NBC on that campaign. So I spent that entire year covering politics. I started in January, followed Jackson through to the primaries in California, but because Jesse Jackson wanted to keep himself in the news, in between the primaries and the convention, we had a trip to Cuba, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. So I did that trip and then covered his appearance at the convention, at the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco. Then I had a choice between whether I was going to cover George Bush's vice president or Geraldine Ferraro. I chose Geraldine Ferraro because that was a history making campaign. I wish I had chosen Bush just for whatever, but it was interesting to be to cover a political campaign, and it's that then was very much a part of how you essentially, as they say, get your ticket punched to move up to the next level. So covering a campaign means you get a great deal more visibility from the folks in New York who make the decisions about who moves up to the next level. And that covering that campaign meant that within the next year or so, I had moved to Washington.
When you moved to Washington, what was your job then? Did you get a higher title, a higher position?
I became a producer with one of the magazine shows. So it was I can't even remember the name of the magazine show, but the goal for me was to stop being what we would essentially have called a fireman, where you get a call from New York, the bureau chief gets a call, and they need somebody to cover a story because a grain elevator is blown up or there's a hurricane. And you're always on your beeper and you're always on the road. You can't really predict your life. And I had had too many years of that. I was really tired of that. So by moving to Washington and working for a magazine show where you could work on it at that point on a story for 2 or 3 months was much more attractive to me. And I had friends who lived in Washington, so that it was for me an improvement on my lifestyle because I didn't have to always be on a beeper and couldn't predict my life, but it also was a chance to do longer form stories.
Where did you go from there?
I stayed at NBC until 1989. And NBC, while NBC now has Dateline and has had Dateline for many years, there was a period of time where NBC was really struggling. CBS had 60 Minutes, ABC had 2020, NBC had like a dozen different shows, none of which were particularly successful. And I got caught up in a couple of that cycle of shows would start and they would end. And the show that I was working on was ending. And again, I faced this issue with the union. The magazine was not a union operation, even though it was in Washington, which had unions for producers and writers. And I found myself either having to jump into the union and have no seniority and be just part of the general pool of producers, or I was offered a job at ABC to be a producer at World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. So that was why I made the decision to leave NBC and go to ABC.
While you were at ABC, what other positions did you have, and how did you progress through your career up until the point you decided to leave that particular part of the industry?
So I became a producer at World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. I talked with the Nightline folks, and Nightline was really interesting because they do great work, or did great work at that point. But I really didn't want to go back into having horrible hours again. I really did want my life to be manageable. So World News Tonight, well, I was, for the most part, Carol Simpson's producer on the longer segments called American Almanac. So those longer in network television evening news is 3 to 4 minutes versus 1.5 to 2 minutes. So I was able to use my television magazine experience in that. I did that for a few years. And, I had the experience that I think anybody who works in corporate America or works, period, I bumped up against a couple of bosses who I didn't get along with. Where I'd had a great relationship with the executive producer at World News Tonight in New York when I first went to ABC. There were then a couple of other people with whom I did not get along. And so I was really struggling, and I just, getting bad assignments, and nothing I did was right in their eyes, even though that I think there was something wrong with them, but they were my bosses. But I was really lucky. I had sort of diverted my attention. I realized that I was kind of stalled professionally in my job, but at the same time, I was becoming involved in other boards. At that point I was a trustee at Radcliffe. I was doing other kinds of things that were helping me develop some leadership skills. And fortunately for me, the bureau chief in Washington, Robin Sproul, who wasn't my immediate boss, she was the boss of the bureau, but not my World News Tonight boss, recognized that I was being underutilized. And Robin has a great talent for helping people become their best selves. And Robin took me out to lunch and offered me the job as deputy bureau chief because she could see that I had, something other than the way that I was being handled at World News Tonight. So I became deputy bureau chief in 1996. I did that for about a year, and then I took about a 6-month leave of absence. I came back to work in the bureau, and the book then came out. And I left ABC after the book came out. The job was changing, and I was fine doing that. But then I was offered the chance to come back as director of talent development, which was a job that was split between New York and DC. So I came back, and I actually did that for 5 years. It's really stunning for me to think about having done it that long. But almost from the moment that I started doing it, I knew that it was time to leave. The industry was changing. I had a great deal of satisfaction working with young correspondents and helping groom them and creating mentoring programs for younger people, trying to make my contribution to some, diversity within the network. But I was outgrowing it, I think. And once Disney bought ABC and the cable stations were really changing the nature of network television news, I just really didn't have the appetite to put up with the stuff anymore. So rather than be an unhappy person, I knew it was time to go.
By this time, was your book profitable? Were you selling copies of your book? How were you supporting yourself financially?
Yeah, I don't think that most people who write books really support themselves from their books. Yes, my book was selling, but it wasn't Michelle Obama's book or Bob Woodward's book. But at that point, I do a lot of speaking, and the speeches were supporting me. So that's really remained the same since then. I'm really fortunate that I've been able to carve out a life that allows me to be independent. And at this point, I'm 68 years old, so that means I have Social Security, I have pension, and then I have other kinds of consulting and other things that I've done ever since.
And as you mentioned earlier, the book was turned into a Netflix series here in 2020.
The best part of the Netflix series is that it has made people aware of Madam Walker, while the Netflix series doesn't really give them an accurate picture of who she was. It does mean that many people want to know more about her. So I am really happy to be able to share that story.
And did it also provide you more visibility so they know who A'Lelia Bundles is and they want you to come speak to their group? What do you usually speak about?
Well, I talk about Madam Walker's life, and I try to make it relevant to what's happening today, both as her entrepreneurship and women and economic independence and her political activity, her philanthropy, that her story is a story of women's empowerment. And so I can talk about women in business. I can talk about women in politics. She gives me, her life is so multidimensional that it gives me a platform to talk about almost anything that I want to talk about.
Speaking about philanthropy, you are on the board of several nonprofit organizations and advisory councils. Is that correct?
That's right.
Tell me about some of those and why you chose to be on them.
So I think that my nonprofit board work really is a result of alumni activities at Harvard and Radcliffe, that's kind of the platform. I mean, of course, I saw my parents being involved in civic activities, and so I had that model from them. But becoming involved in alumni activities meant that I had some entree to what that world was like. And even I think long before I probably really should have been a trustee at Radcliffe, I was a trustee at Radcliffe, but I was embraced by the group. And then that turned into other things. While I was still at ABC, it was hard to do some of the nonprofit boards that I wanted to do just from a time standpoint. And the last manager that I had wasn't particularly supportive of me doing those things. If I'd had a different boss at that time, the boss in New York, I might have done more. But once I left ABC, all of a sudden I thought, okay, now is my time to do some of these things I've been wanting to do. And I was invited to be on the National Archives Foundation board. Cokie Roberts, one of my ABC colleagues, had been on that board for a long time. They were very interested in having more diversity on the board. So I joined the National Archives Foundation board in 2006. And that is the nonprofit partner of the National Archives and Records Administration, a federal agency which cannot raise its own funds. So the National Archives Foundation raises funds for exhibitions and programming to support and raise awareness of what the National Archives does. So I joined that in 2006. I became chairman of the board and was chairman for 2 3-year terms, and I'm now chair emerita. And I was really glad to be in that position, especially for the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, and to get a sense of all the holdings at the National Archives that involve African Americans. Of course, it speaks to my interest in genealogy as well as my interest in social justice and politics. And I was invited to become more involved in Columbia's journalism school alumni activities. I chaired an advisory board that did some revamping of the Alumni Association, and then I was invited to be a trustee at Columbia, which was very different from Harvard overseers. And I have been a trustee at Columbia and vice chair, one of the vice chairs of the board. It's actually now 13 years. It's 2 6-year terms, and I was extended, and now I've been extended for a few more months because of COVID, but I will be leaving that board shortly. And then I've done a number of other advisory boards. Really happy that I'm still on a connection with Radcliffe on the Schlesinger board. I had been president of the Radcliffe College Alumni Association. I think I was the second to last president before it was totally subsumed into Harvard. And March on Washington Film Festival. But I tend to do things those advisory boards are things that I just enjoy and enjoy the people with whom I'm working.
You've won some major awards and recognition. Tell me about those.
Well, I do have an Emmy for work that I did at NBC and a DuPont Gold Baton from work that I did at ABC. But, I would say that while it is really lovely to have those, people often say that these awards sometimes don't come for the things that you care most about. The Emmy at NBC comes from a documentary that NBC did on Reagan, his last day in office. It was kind of a quickly put together live television, but I did something on Reagan's interactions with the military. I mean, I can't even, but it's still nice to have been part of the team that won an Emmy. The DuPont Gold Baton that I won, that I got when I was at ABC, was part of a series on women's health, a major commitment of time on ABC's part. So that was great. But both of these are pieces that really are not, I would not say, were the high points of my life at either place. Some of the pieces that I did, I thought my work on the child murders at NBC and my work on Jesse Jackson's campaign, those things were very important to me. Some of the pieces that I did when I was working on the magazine show at NBC, I did a piece on Daufuskie Island and how it was changing and becoming gentrified. And one of the first pieces, network pieces on adult children of alcoholics, and then another piece on in vitro fertilization. Those are pieces that I remember as being work that I was very proud of.
You also are a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Phi Beta Kappa.
Right. Those things feel really good. It's very nice to have those pieces on my resume.
And the New York Times recognized your book.
I was really pleased after all of the work and all of the research on Madam Walker that On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker was recognized by the New York Times as one of its notable books. They always recognize at the end of each year. So it was great. I would have written that book anyway. I really put a lot of heart and soul, blood, sweat, and tears into that book, and so it is nice that it was recognized by the Times, and it is really lovely for me that so many professors still use the book, and that when people really want to know Madam Walker's story, that is the go-to book.
For what were you recognized by the Association of Black Women Historians, Letitia Woods Brown Prize? What was that associated with?
So I received the Association of Black Women Historians, Letitia Woods Brown Prize for On Her Own Ground. I really feel good when I wrote On Her Own Ground, it was the first major biography of Madam Walker, surprisingly. But I think this is the case with the stories of many African Americans. There weren't many books being written about major African American figures prior to the 1970s. They might have been written, but they weren't being published. Let us say that. So when I wrote On Her Own Ground, it was recognized by the New York Times. It was recognized by the Association of Black Women Historians, the American Library Association's Black Caucus, because I think humbly that it was a contribution to the canon of Black history and American history. And I very much tried to tell not only the story of Madam C.J. Walker, which needed to be told on its own, but the story of that first generation of African Americans after the Civil War and up until the time of World War I, who were creating some of the institutions and the businesses and the organizations that were showing what was possible for a people who had been so discriminated against.
While I was at Spelman in the 1990s in the cafeteria, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but there are portraits of notable Black women all over the walls. And Madam C.J. Walker was there staring at us every day in the cafeteria. So we were very familiar with her and her story, but a lot of these books weren't being published. Their stories weren't being told, although we knew about her.
Right.
Like you said, it wasn't stories that were being documented in the fashion that you did.
Significantly for me, because my grandmother went to Spelman, but one of the first speeches I ever gave was at Spelman at Thursdays in the chapel.
Convocation, yes.
Yeah, convocation about Madam Walker. But I was very, very nervous. I remember now I can speak, and nothing makes me nervous when I'm doing public speaking. But at that point, I was really nervous. And I had coincidentally, Alex Haley was in Atlanta for some speech that he was giving, and Alex was a mentor of mine, and I had been doing research for him because he was planning to do a mini-series and a book about Madam Walker. And I remember talking with him the night before and at dinner, and I said, "Oh, I've got to give this speech tomorrow, and I don't know, I'm nervous." And he said, just tell good stories, baby. Just take a deep breath. So I was armed with advice from Alex Haley, and I was really honored to be part of a Spelman Convocation.
Did you get married? Have you been married?
I have a wonderful significant other with whom I don't know, it's many, many years. I don't know how many years. I'm trying to think, almost 25 years. I can't count. But yeah, a really great significant other.
What are your thoughts about marriage?
Marriage is great. But that's just not what I did. But I have I have nothing against marriage. But I am very happy in my life. And it's just, it's a long time. We've been together for a very long time, and very comfortably, and it's very easy, and that's what works for me. And I will say, last year in particular, I felt so fortunate because it was a really difficult year. My father and both of my brothers died within 12 weeks of each other.
Wow.
And so I had an incredible amount of support, and for which I am really grateful, with no muss, no fuss, just there. And that was really great.
Were any of their passings anticipated?
In combination, my father was 92, so 92. Great to have had him around for as long as he was, and he lived a really great life. And the previous May, I had given the commencement speech at Indiana University's Indianapolis campus. He coincidentally had graduated exactly 70 years earlier and was able to come to that commencement. So we spent a really great few days together. We stayed in, the fancy house that the chancellor of IU owns in Indianapolis, and he was treated royally for a place where he had not been all that welcome 70 years earlier. So we'd had a really nice time together, within the year before he died. So we knew that he was starting to have cognitive problems. My brother, Lance, who's 3 years younger than I, was diagnosed with lung cancer. And coincidentally, the same weekend that my father's wife sent me a note with saying that his diagnosis was Lewy body dementia, I texted my brother and I said, give me a call so we can talk about this. And I didn't hear from him all day. And that evening he called me from the emergency room because he was having what would eventually be diagnosed as lung cancer. So I got that blow back to back within a few hours. And during the next 9 months, I was back and forth to Indianapolis every 3 weeks to be with my brother as he went through chemo. And then my other brother died unexpectedly. He was, very dependent on my dad, even though he was in his 50s. And I think he would have had I knew he was having a hard time processing my father's death. So for me, the blessing of good friends and people around you, and, a lot of meditation, a lot of, as my mother used to say, good mental hygiene. So I'm tooling along. I did not fall apart. And I'm really grateful that this all happened last year, not this year, because I just don't know how I would have dealt with it.
Absolutely, since we're in the middle of the pandemic for COVID-19. Do you have nieces, nephews, children?
I have some wonderful godchildren. So I am, super, super proud of them.
Your brothers never had children?
No.
Was there, or has there been any discussion on carrying on the family name and possibly having a girl named Alelia and continuing the telling of the story of your family?
I feel really fortunate that there are some young scholars who are good friends of mine who are now written books or writing books, people who are really going to take things on forward. So Tyrone McKinley Freeman is one of my younger friends. He's not a baby. He's in his 40s, so he's no baby. But Tyrone McKinley Freeman has a book coming out in a few weeks, actually, called Madam Walker's Gospel of Giving, where he's a professor of philanthropy, so he has really drilled down on her philanthropy and developed some dimensions that I hadn't really developed. So I'm really thrilled with that. There are other historians who cite my work and who are expanding on my work. So I think that will make sure the story is told. You can't always count on your children to be interested in the same thing that you're interested in. So I feel lucky that I have some younger scholars who are doing
just
this.
As you didn't go into the hair industry.
That's right. That's right.
So you and your brothers never felt pressured, or did you feel pressured to have someone to carry on the family name?
No, I think life just unfolds the way it does. You can't pressure people to do things.
Your parents didn't pressure you, or other family members didn't pressure you, or your brothers?
No, and I think even if you pressure people, that doesn't mean they're going to do what you want them to do. Yeah, I just can't even. I can't even imagine what that conversation would be like. And and though I will say that I have seen, I do, certainly even when you don't have children of your own, you still were a child of somebody, and you still know what that feels like. And I have seen parents, both people who are my contemporaries and people whose parents pressured them. And I just think that always has a really bad outcome, to try to make somebody do something that they're not really interested in. And I feel so fortunate that my parents really encouraged me to do what I really wanted to do, within reason. Like, you have to be able to support yourself. And,
Right.
That's really important. What I did, I do remember having a conversation with my father when I was leaving ABC News. And I said, so Daddy, I'm just letting you know that this is the week. This is my last day. And he just kind of freaked out. And I thought, he's a child of the Depression. And in his mind, he likes to tell people that his daughter, works for ABC News or whatever. But I said, I will be fine. I will be able to support myself. And I have, been able to support myself. I knew that I could. And I'm happy.
All very, very important and admirable.
Right.
So take me back when you were at the conference and you met with that genealogist, Coy Robbins, who told you about your Revolutionary War ancestor. How did you go from that to deciding that you want to join the Daughters of the American Revolution, especially considering how interested you were in social justice and the diversity and the advancement of Black people?
Yeah, I think that my interest in joining the DAR really is because my friend Laura Murphy is in the DAR. And Laura is not only a descendant of a soldier, she's a descendant of a signer, the Declaration of Independence. So Laura and I are good friends, and I could see she had gone to a couple of meetings, and that looked interesting. So I started exploring that, and then it was actually a pretty easy process.
Is Laura African American?
Yes.
So Laura was already a member, and you saw, there's Black members are a part of the DAR, and that gave you more interest, or did it feel like it might be more of a more diverse society than you expected? How did that play upon you when you found out that she was a member?
But I knew that there were there were African Americans who were members. I remember reading articles about that and thinking, okay, I could, I actually would qualify for this, but I didn't have any, strong desire to really participate. But then when I saw that Laura was a member, I think she went to a brunch and she was telling me about it. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And I am accustomed to being a bit of a pioneer. But in this case, I didn't even have to be a pioneer, that there were other people who had already opened that door, and it made it look like it was pretty easy to walk through that door.
So you decided to join, but was there a basis of why you were joining? Why did you take that step to actually say, oh, this looks interesting, Laura's doing it, let me go investigate it, but why actually follow through and become a member?
Honestly, just because I knew I could. And I just think it is really important to sort of stake this claim in who we are in America. I have this memory of being at the Mayflower Hotel. ABC News is on DeSale Street at Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. And right across the street is the Mayflower Hotel. And I remember walking through that lobby a couple of years in a row when there were many, many women from the DAR with all of their regalia and their buttons and their big hats walking through. And I just remember thinking, this is not my group of folks. This is not who I am. These are the people who didn't want Marian Anderson to perform. This is not my group. And then as I began to hear about other Black women being involved, and especially with my friend Laura Murphy being involved, I thought, well, why not? If there's a show of force in numbers. If you qualify for this, if you have the connections, then you ought to, in a sense, vote, cast your ballot to show that you are part of this and that you are eligible for it. It was really just making a statement that, here's yet another person who is part of the making of this nation, and we deserve to be here.
You joined in April of 2013, so you've been a member for about 7 years. When you joined, did you have any difficulty putting together your application papers? Did anyone kind of help you assemble that information?
The process is now so regularized that it really wasn't that difficult. Because of the research that Coy Robbins had done, I knew who my patriot was. I knew that Ishmael Roberts was my patriot. And people were very helpful to me. There was a person who I think may have been assigned to be a specialist with descendants of people of color, African American patriots, and I was helped every step of the way, and it really was not a very difficult process.
Was this a white member of the DAR that helped you?
It was.
And she was very welcoming and receptive. Is that what I understand?
Extremely welcoming. She was very, very helpful and said, let me do whatever I can to make sure that this happens and make sure that this is easy for you. She was extremely helpful.
Have you been able to be active in the society since you've joined?
I have been not very active, and I regret that. I went to a couple of meetings. I went to an assembly. I have my pen. I have my sash, but I haven't really been able to be very active in almost anything within the last few years because when I was chair of the board of the National Archives Foundation, that was like having a job, an unpaid job, nevertheless, but like having a job. And being a trustee at Columbia, between the two of those things, it really kind of ate up all of my available oxygen. And I'm trying to write a book. So I have not had a lot of free time for some of the other things that where I didn't have a leadership role where I had to be particularly focused.
You currently live in Washington, D.C., and you're a member in a Washington, D.C. chapter. So I assume that you did go to, when you said you attended an assembly, that was Continental Congress. Is that correct? That's the annual, right. That's the annual national convention for the Daughters of the American Revolution, where all of the chapters travel from all over the United States and the world to assemble in DAR Constitution Hall and its headquarters buildings to have their annual conference. And over 3,000 women typically attend and fill up what is Washington, D.C.'s largest concert venue. So when you were there, can you describe what you saw and how you felt when you walked into the building?
It really is a majestic ceremony. And I had been in that building before for concerts, but never for a DAR assembly. But you really do see a great deal of pride with people who know that they have some connection to some of the founders of the nation. I have not been to an assembly since that, after that first year, or to a Continental Congress since after that first year, but I have gone to many of the brunches that are hosted by the women who are descendants of African American patriots. And that's always very interesting to just hear the stories. And many people are extremely involved and have leadership roles. And I admire them for carrying that torch and for making sure that we are well represented.
Going back to Continental Congress when you were there and let's talk about the pageantry of the evening. I assume that you went to one of the evening events, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Where everyone's dressed in long ball gowns and formal length gowns, and men are in tuxedos. And then there's a military band that plays at the opening of each evening's ceremony. And then the American flag drops from the ceiling. Did you feel a certain way in singing the national anthem with everyone? Did any of these type of exercises make you feel a certain way about yourself and being in the room with these other women celebrating their ancestors' contribution to the independence of the United States?
You know, my honest answer is no. I mean, I appreciate the theater and I appreciate the pageantry, but it is a show. And I guess maybe I'm not a person who swells up at the playing of the national anthem, because I know that this is all much more complicated than that. My patriotism is not a no matter what patriotism. My patriotism is I really expect America to do better and to keep moving towards a more perfect union, and we're not there. So I view it through those eyes. Maybe I view it through those eyes because I'm a journalist. Maybe I view it through those eyes because I'm a Black woman. But I am glad that I have two ancestors who were part of the Continental Army. And I'm glad that I can stake that claim and that I can say that my family has been here for many generations and has contributed to America, but I don't have a do or die sense of patriotism. But I'm glad that the Black people are in the DAR now, and I'm glad that there is an organization that recognizes the contributions of all of the people who were part of the American Revolution, that we pay attention to that history. And I am glad that it is now recognizing the contributions of people other than white people.
How do people react, or do you even tell people that you're a member of the DAR?
Yeah, and I do. Yes, I do mention it. And I mention it to make a point, to say that people of color, African Americans, were here from the beginning of this American experiment. And I want people to know that. We have been here a really long time. And I especially make the point with people whose ancestors came after mine, who want to say that they are real Americans because they're white. And I feel very militant about this. This is one of those things. I am a real American. My family was here from the beginning. My ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. I am a real American. And those other folks who came much, much later will not be able to push me out of the way, no matter how hard they try. And some of them are trying very hard.
What would you say to some that push back and say that, yes, your ancestors fought for the American Revolution, but that revolution also took away the land and the rights from the first Americans that were here, the Native Americans? So why are you proud of being a part of that kind of violence against Native Americans that happened by founding the United States?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is why America is really, really complicated, because despite what some of the people who want to interpret American history as glorious and wonderful and everything was perfect, America was really built on the backs of destroying the indigenous people, and it was profited by not paying the people who were doing the hard labor. So America is a complicated place. My ancestors were trying to keep themselves from being slaughtered. So I think it's a complicated history. Some of my ancestors, I believe, are Native American, though my DNA test has not shown that. But as the records about Ishmael Roberts say, he was a Lumbee Indian, so he would have been among the people descended from indigenous people who was just trying to survive.
Do you tell your colleagues in passing that you are a member of the DAR? Maybe at a meeting, has it ever, I don't know, just come up casually? How do they react when you tell them that?
No, I don't know that I say it casually. I mean, but I do. I actually do like to mention it in certain situations especially when I was chair of the board of the National Archives Foundation. We have a big 4th of July event, a big breakfast and a reenactment and a reading of the Declaration of Independence. And so I would often give opening remarks. And I knew it would always shock people when I would say that I am a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Many people would kind of look and say, oh, how can that possibly be? But I really enjoyed that reaction. When I was chair, I also gave remarks. We would host the new class of members of the Senate in a small dinner at the National Archives. They had a tour, and as I gave remarks, when I'm looking at some of these people who assume that Black people really probably ought not to be present in America, I always enjoyed saying that here we are in the home of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Declaration of Independence. And I'm very proud to say that I have 2 ancestors who were in the Continental Army, because I know that it is a shock. And I like being able to shock them because they don't know their history and they would erase me from their history.